The river ran black that spring, thick with melt and silt and the ash of distant fires. No one remembered who had set them. Towns vanished overnight, swallowed by smoke and the bloody appetites of men riding east. It was the kind of season where grief itself seemed woven into the air, heavy and sour. Mara knew grief. She wore it like a second skin when they dragged her into the clearing. The settlers had come from the lowlands, bringing with them strange iron and strange ways. They'd taken the fertile lands first, then the streams, then the woods where her people hunted. When hunger made fighters of them, when they dared strike back, the settlers answered with ropes and rifles. They called it law. They called it peace. In the end, they caught her, the youngest, the least useful in the eyes of the elders. A small thing with dirt under her nails and blood dried at the corner of her mouth. They shackled her wrists and ankles and marched her across the ruined fields until they found a post, a single weathered trunk planted deep into the ground. Maybe once it had tethered horses, maybe men, it didn't matter. They chained her there without ceremony. The leader, a man called Holt, spat at her feet and laughed when she didn't flinch. His sons and hired guns gathered round to watch, the metal links clinking dully as they tightened the cuffs. She was left standing in the open, arms stretched painfully above her head, the chain biting into raw skin. "We'll let the sun bake the fight out of her," Holt said. "Maybe let the wolves finish what the old ones couldn't." The first day passed in silence. Mara's lips cracked, her skin blistered. She counted the hours in the tilt of shadows, in the buzz of flies. The settlers watched her, but they grew bored quickly. Some took to drink. Some left altogether, riding off to harass another village or burn another patch of woods. Mara listened carefully. Every time they shifted the chain, she felt its flaws. The links were poorly smithed, welded quick by impatient hands. Rust chewed the edges where rain had found its way in. She tested the give of the post, too, feeling how it swayed minutely in the wet earth after each gust of wind. At night, the cold was worse than the sun. She dreamed of the forge her mother had once tended. An old, cracked anvil, a bellows made of stitched deer hide, the smell of scorched iron. Before the settlers came, before the fear came, Mara had been meant to learn the trade. Now she had nothing but her own body and the dead weight of her chains. The second day brought jeers. The youngest of Holt's sons, a pale, freckled boy who couldn't have been much older than Mara herself, approached her with a stick. He prodded her ribs, laughing when she staggered sideways against the pull of the manacles. His father watched from a distance, making no move to stop him. "You ain't much use, girl," the boy said. "Too skinny, should have strung you up proper." Mara said nothing. She kept her head low, let the hair hide her face. Inside, she measured the boy's steps, the closeness of the onlookers, the length of the chain. That night it rained. Cold needles of water sluiced down her back, soaking the iron and deepening the ache in her bones. But the post softened further. The ground around it grew spongy under her bare feet. A plan began to take shape in the hollows of her mind, slow and careful, the way coals burn under green wood. On the third day, the settlers started to forget she was there. Another skirmish called them away. A band of riders from the south, ragged survivors like herself, had burned one of Holt's grain stores. Men scrambled for rifles. Holt himself left, swearing he'd bring back scalps for every ear lost. Mara was alone except for the freckled boy and a handful of drunk, lazy guards. One passed out near the fire. Another wandered into the woods to piss and didn't return. By the light of the dying fire, Mara began her work. She twisted and strained, forcing the weakest links of the chain against the corner of the post. She let the weight of her body do the work, digging the rust deeper into the splintered wood. Hours passed. Her wrists bled freely. Her legs trembled. More than once she nearly fell into unconsciousness, but hatred kept her awake, a steady, bottomless reservoir she had not known she carried. Just before dawn, with a muffled crack, the first link broke free. She dropped to her knees, gasping, her hands still shackled but no longer tethered to the post. The chain dangled from her wrists like a heavy rope of snakes, but it was hers now. It was hers. Mara did not run. She did not scream. She crept. Dragging the chain behind her, she found the passed-out guard. He still clutched his rifle loosely across his chest. She smashed the length of chain across his throat before he could open his eyes, feeling the larynx crunch under the weight. His death was not clean, but it was final. From his belt she stole a knife, a simple thing, battered and dirty, but it might as well have been a king's sword in her hands. She severed the cuffs from her ankles first, using the point of the blade to pry apart the weakened hinges. Her wrists she left chained, for now. The weight gave her an advantage, an unexpected reach in close quarters. By the time the freckled boy stumbled out of his tent, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Mara was waiting. She caught him with a looping strike of the chain, dragging him forward by the neck. His hands clawed uselessly at the iron biting into his throat. Mara looked into his pale, terrified face and found no satisfaction there, only necessity. She drove the knife into his side once, twice, until he stopped moving. By mid-morning, the clearing was silent. The post stood bare in the center, the broken chain gleaming darkly against the trampled mud. Mara did not leave. She found the forge, an afterthought behind the settlers' camp, and set to work. The chains would not simply be a relic of her suffering. They would become something else, something sharp, something hungry. They would become her voice. They would become her vengeance. The settlers returned at dusk, tired and blooded, trailing smoke and the scent of burnt meat. Holt rode at the front, his face streaked with grime, a bloodied hatchet resting across his saddle horn. Behind him, the horses carried the spoils of their cruelty, sacks of grain, bundles of stolen blankets, a scattering of broken bodies tied over saddles. They smelled the death before they saw it. Holt's second son, Brant, dismounted first, rifle cocked against his shoulder. He found the boy's body near the fire, twisted and cold, the color long gone from his freckled face. Holt followed, a tightness settling over his mouth. The clearing was wrong, too still. The post stood empty. The chain, that hated chain, was missing. "Spread out," Holt barked. "Find her." The men obeyed. They stomped through the wet underbrush, rifles low, nerves taut. Every whisper of wind against the trees sounded like breath. Every flicker of shadow made fingers twitch on triggers. Mara watched from the trees, her body pressed deep into the crook of an old cedar. She had spent the day hidden there, the stolen knife sheathed against her thigh, the chains now reshaped. With a flat stone and the settler's own crude forge, she had battered the links into cruel hooks and jagged edges. She had split the length into 3 pieces, wrapping 2 about her forearms and saving the third for the strike. She had no army, no cavalry, only the quiet, the cold, and her will. They searched deeper into the woods, farther from one another, breaking their own lines in their eagerness. Mara moved as the old hunters had taught her, slow as the creeping moss, silent as the owls. She found the first man pissing against a tree, his back turned, his rifle leaning against the bark. She wrapped the hook chain around his throat and yanked. The iron teeth bit deep. He struggled, kicking against her shins, but Mara held fast. When he sagged, she eased him down among the ferns and stole his belt, his ammunition. One less. By nightfall, 2 more had vanished into the blackness, their bodies hidden beneath the heavy moss and under the rotting leaves. Panic began to splinter the settlers' resolve. They fired blindly into the trees, cursing, calling to each other in harsh, broken voices. But Mara did not answer. She moved among them like a rumor, like a fevered dream, always just out of reach, always there, breathing down their necks. She found Holt last. He had retreated to the clearing, standing in the center with his rifle across his chest, turning slow, eyes sharp. His breath steamed in the cold. Around him, the bodies of his sons and his men sagged in the mud, their blood soaking into the ruined earth. "You think you're clever," he growled into the emptiness. "You think you're strong." Mara stepped from the shadows then, the broken chain wrapped around her fists, the knife glinting from her belt. Her hair hung in wet, ragged strands across her face. Her eyes gleamed like a wolf's. Holt raised his rifle. She was faster. She flung the jagged chain first, a spinning snarl of iron that struck the barrel from his grasp. It clattered to the ground, skittering out of reach. Holt lunged for the hatchet at his belt, but Mara was already upon him. She drove the knife up under his ribs, feeling the grisly give of flesh and bone. He grunted, staggered, swung a fist wide. She ducked, raked the chain across his eyes, blinding him. He fell to his knees, blood pouring from the ruin of his face. "You chain me like an animal," Mara said, her voice low, ragged from disuse. "Now you'll die like one." She did not make it quick, she made it right. When it was finished, she left Holt's body nailed to the same post where they had left her, his own broken rifle lashed across his chest like a mockery of honor. The settlers who survived fled into the night, leaving their dead and dying behind. Mara stood alone in the clearing as the fire guttered low, the blood drying on her arms, the chains heavy against her skin. The iron was hers now. The pain was hers. The vengeance was hers. But there were others beyond these woods, men like Holt, towns like this one. She could not stop here. Mara gathered what she needed, weapons, supplies, a battered horse left tethered to a stump, and set out before dawn, leaving no sign of her passing but the mark of what she had become. A ghost, a blade, a reckoning born of rust and blood. The frontier was wider than Mara had ever known, wider and crueler. She rode the stolen horse south, through miles of charred woodlands and across rivers that frothed with spring floods. The wind carried the scent of burning homesteads and the faint, bitter tang of gunpowder. It was not only Holt's camp that had fallen to ruin. The whole territory groaned under the weight of lawless men who took what they wanted and called it taming. Settlers wore their cruelty like armor, building their fortunes atop graves too shallow to hide the dead. Mara moved among them unseen. She kept to the lesser trails, the hidden places. Sometimes she scavenged from abandoned cabins, taking only what she could carry. Other times she waited in the deep woods for hunters to pass, plucking their supplies from their bodies after their horses returned riderless to the trail. Word of her spread long before she showed her face. They called her the Iron Ghost. Some said she was a squaw's spirit, risen from the massacres. Others whispered she was a runaway slave, wielding the very chains that once held her. No one agreed on the details, but all agreed on one thing: wherever she passed, blood followed. In a town called Dalton's Hollow, she found the next piece of her path. The hollow was not much. A crooked main street lined with lean-tos and sagging storefronts, a saloon that never closed, and a jailhouse that served mostly as a slaughterhouse for whoever displeased the local boss. That boss was Eli Vance. He was older than Holt had been, clever too. Vance ran the hollow the way a man runs cattle, with whip and branding iron. His deputies were worse, men who delighted in cruelty for its own sake, whose badges were nothing more than licenses to spill blood. Mara entered the hollow at dusk, wrapped in a tattered cloak, her head low. Her chains were hidden beneath the folds of cloth, the jagged lengths coiled tight against her forearms. She kept the horse tethered beyond the ridge, trusting no one. She made her way to the saloon first, where news traveled faster than mail. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and cheap whiskey. Men hunched over their drinks, spitting curses into the sawdust. Women with bruised arms and hollow eyes drifted between tables, offering smiles that didn't reach their mouths. Mara sat near the back, watching, listening. She learned that Vance had strung up a family just 2 days past farmers who'd refused to pay his taxes. The father had been gutted in the square. The mother had been given to the deputies before being tossed in the river. Their 2 children had vanished. Mara's hands curled into fists beneath the table. When night deepened, she slipped out into the alleys. She found the jailhouse where Vance's men kept their prisoners. A squat stone building with a barred front and a single oil lamp guttering near the door. 2 deputies guarded it, their rifles propped lazily against the wall. Mara watched them from the shadows, weighing her options. A direct assault would bring the whole town down on her. She needed to be precise, surgical. The chain around her right forearm felt heavier somehow, thrumming with an old, feral hunger. She waited until one of the men wandered off to relieve himself, leaving the other dozing in his chair. Then she moved. The chain uncoiled from her wrist with a whir, catching the seated man across the mouth. His head snapped back with a wet crunch. Before the second deputy could return, Mara dragged the body into the shadows. She melted into the building like smoke. Inside, the cells were half empty. Only one was occupied, a young girl, maybe 12, wrapped in a filthy blanket, her face bruised and swollen. The girl flinched when Mara approached, drawing back against the wall. "Quiet," Mara said, voice rough with disuse. "I'm not one of them." The girl hesitated, then nodded. Mara picked the lock with a broken nail file she had carried since the clearing, working it with steady, practiced hands. When the door swung open, the girl clutched her side, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "Can you walk?" A nod. Mara led her out the back, slipping through alleys like a shadow in a world that had forgotten how to see. They didn't make it far before the alarm was raised. A gunshot cracked the night open, followed by shouts. Torches flared to life along the street. Mara pushed the girl behind a water barrel. "Stay down," she said. Then she turned to face the storm. Deputies spilled from the saloon and the general store, a drunken mob bristling with iron and hate. Mara met them head-on. The chains sang in her hands. She fought not like a soldier, but like a fury, darting low, striking fast. She tore rifles from hands, shattered kneecaps, split skulls. Blood sprayed the dirt streets, steam rising from the pooling gore. The townsfolk watched from windows, too afraid to intervene, too complicit to turn away. Eli Vance himself stumbled out of the saloon last, his coat flapping, his revolver already drawn. He fired wild, the shot missing Mara by inches. He screamed curses, called her every filthy name he could summon. Mara caught his wrist mid-shot. She twisted until she felt bone crack. Vance howled, dropping the pistol. Mara seized a length of broken chain from her belt and looped it around his throat. She dragged him into the center of the street, into the gaze of every coward hiding behind their shutters. "You rule by fear," she said. Vance's face purpled as he clawed at the iron. "Now fear will rule you." She made an example of him. By morning, Dalton's Hollow was empty save for the dead and the dying. The girl rode with Mara then, tucked small behind her on the horse, clutching the rough wool of her cloak with blood-slicked fingers. She never asked where they were going. There was nowhere safe. Only forward. Only the long, brutal road Mara had carved for herself. The girl spoke her name only once, Lark. After that, they traveled mostly in silence, two shadows riding the borderlands where no maps dared tread. Villages lay empty ahead of them, fields torched to stubble behind. Whole counties had emptied out, swallowed by a fear that had no face but left a trail of broken men in its wake. Mara taught Lark the way the world had taught her, with blood, with hunger, with silence. She showed her how to bind a wound with scraps of cloth, how to catch a rabbit with bare hands, how to move through trees without stirring a single leaf. Most important, she showed her how to kill. It was not a lesson Mara took pride in. It was simply necessary. The girl learned quickly. There were always more enemies waiting, farther west, farther south. Mara never went looking for them. They found her all the same, raiders who called themselves sovereigns, mercenaries who wore the emblems of old regiments on their tattered sleeves, men who built their kingdoms atop ash and demanded worship in return. When they crossed into Carrion Flats, they found something worse. The flats stretched for miles, a broken plain of salt and rock where nothing grew but thorn and boneweed. Scavengers ruled there, packs of men so wild they barely spoke, living off whatever they could trap or burn. They were led by a woman called Selby, whose cruelty made Holt and Vance seem tame. Selby's gang found them under a red moon. It started with the horse, shot from beneath Mara without warning, its body collapsing in a grunt of blood and dust. Mara hit the ground rolling, yanking Lark behind a rise of stones. Arrows whistled overhead. War cries tore through the air, rough-throated and feral. Mara counted at least 20. Too many. She pressed the battered pistol she had taken from Vance into Lark's hands. "Ride if you can," she whispered. "Shoot if you must." Lark shook her head fiercely, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. She clutched Mara's sleeve with small, desperate fingers. Mara pried them loose. "I will find you," she said. Then she ran. She drew the scavengers after her, leading them deeper into the flats where the rocks broke into jagged ridges and the salt crusted into sharp, blinding drifts. The chains weighed heavy on her back, tucked into a makeshift sling. Her boots tore open at the seams. Blood slicked her heels. Still she ran. The scavengers, drunk on bloodlust, chased her into a canyon carved by ancient floods. Their shouts echoed off the stone walls, louder than their numbers. They believed her cornered. They believed her broken. They did not understand. Mara had been broken before. What rose from those chains was something else entirely. She made her stand in the canyon. She ripped the chains free and coiled them in her fists, the jagged hooks flashing under the crimson light. She waited until the first of Selby's men rushed her, a broad-shouldered brute with a rusted axe. She sidestepped the blow, looping the chain around his neck and hauling him off balance. The second man tripped over the first, giving Mara just enough time to drive a shard of chain into his throat. The others hesitated, wary now. Selby herself appeared then, striding through her ranks without fear. She was tall and whip-thin, her skin cracked and weathered by years under the sun. Her hair was cropped short, her face painted with ash and blood. A long knife hung from her belt, curved like a vulture's beak. "You're the ghost," Selby said, voice low and cold. Mara said nothing. Selby smiled. "Good, I was getting tired of killing cowards." She struck first, the knife flashing toward Mara's ribs. Mara deflected with the chains, the impact sending shock up her arms. They circled each other, striking and withdrawing, testing, probing. Selby was fast, but Mara was faster. Rage honed her reflexes to a blade's edge. It was not a clean fight. It ended with both of them bleeding, both breathing ragged, and Mara's chain looped tight around Selby's arm, pulling her close enough that Mara could slam the hooked links into her chest. Selby staggered back, gurgling blood, the knife slipping from her fingers. The scavengers looked to their fallen leader, unsure, afraid. Mara raised her bloodied chain high. "This is the price," she said, her voice carrying in the canyon. "This is the cost of your terror." One by one, the scavengers dropped their weapons. When the sun rose over Carrion Flats, it found Mara standing alone among the bodies, the salt wind lifting the tattered hem of her cloak. She gathered what supplies she could from the dead and set off north, her wounds singing with each step. She found Lark 3 days later, hidden in a hollowed-out tree near a dry creek, pale and shivering but alive. Without a word, Mara knelt and pulled the girl into her arms. For the first time since the chains had been welded to her skin, she let herself feel something more than hate, a sliver of something raw, dangerous, and almost unbearable. Hope, but Mara knew better than to trust it. The world was not finished with them yet. It never would be. Summer clawed its way into the land with a heat so vicious that even the flies gave up. Rivers shrank to muddy ribbons, forests burned where the lightning struck, hunger gnawed at every living thing. Mara and Lark moved north, always north, chasing rumors of a place where the land had not yet been claimed by butchers. The maps were liars. Every town they found was ruled by men wearing iron and speaking only in the language of ownership. Every green place had already been carved up and bled dry. But something else had begun to stir. In the broken towns and among the ashes, people spoke of the Iron Ghost not just with fear, but with longing. Mothers soothed crying children with stories of her. Drunken men at dying fires swore they had seen her tear open forts with nothing but chains in her bare, bloodied hands. Farmhands, freedmen, escaped prisoners, they waited for her the way dying men wait for rain. Mara did not want it. She had no interest in leading men or raising banners. Her war was her own, and it had always been fought with silence, not with speeches. Still, wherever they passed, others began to follow. It started with two, a limping trapper whose family had been slaughtered in the hills, and a laundress who had lost both sons to the gallows. They rode behind her without asking permission, keeping to the edges of the trail, heads low. Then came more, a broken preacher, a half-dozen hollow-eyed women, a boy so young he could barely lift the pistol he carried. Mara tried to shake them. She changed trails, led them through marsh and waste. Still they came, drawn by something they could not name, something carved into her very bones. Lark was the one who finally spoke the truth. "They're not following you," she said one night as they crouched over a small fire. "They're following what you made yourself into." Mara stared into the flames. She thought of the clearing, the post, the chain cutting into raw flesh. She thought of the forge behind the settlers' camp, the anvil singing under her fists. She thought of Holt and Vance and Selby and the dozens who would never rise from the places she had left them. She had not been made by mercy, only by rage. Only by blood. North of the timberline, the last bastion of the so-called New Order had taken root. A fortress town named Redemption, though there was no redemption within its high stone walls. It was ruled by a man called Bishop Crane, a preacher turned warlord who dressed his killings in scripture and burned dissenters in the public square. It was there Mara led them. She said nothing to the ones who followed, made no promises. She simply pointed her horse to the horizon and rode. When redemption rose out of the mists, it looked less like a town than a wound on the earth. Tall spires scraped the sky, hung with the corpses of those who had dared say no. Black banners snapped in the bitter wind. Crane stood atop his walls and laughed when he saw them coming, this rabble of farmers and fugitives, half-starved and poorly armed. He sent his riders to scatter them. Mara met the riders at the gates. The chains she wore had been reforged again and again along the journey, tempered by blood and fire. Now they gleamed black as obsidian, honed to a cruel, perfect purpose. She spun them in deadly arcs, breaking bones, splitting skulls. The first line of defenders fell without slowing her advance. Behind her, the others fought not for conquest, not for glory, but because there was no life left for them but this. They fought because Mara fought, because she showed them that it could be done. They stormed the walls. Mara reached Crane last, finding him standing in his sanctuary, a grand hall filled with stolen gold and blasphemous relics. He wore a robe stitched from the flags of the towns he had burned. His hands were clean, though his kingdom was built on rot. He greeted her with open arms. "I have been waiting for you," he said, his voice rich, oily. Mara said nothing. "You are righteous," Crane continued, circling her. "You are strong, we could rule together, imagine it." He spread his arms wide. "Iron and flame, blood and chains. You and me, sister, no more crawling in the dirt." For the first time in a long while, Mara smiled. It was a terrible thing to see. She struck him across the mouth with the heavy end of the chain, shattering teeth. He stumbled, roaring in pain, drawing a pistol from beneath his robe. Mara closed the distance before he could fire, wrapping the chain around his wrist and wrenching the gun free. Crane fought like a cornered rat, scratching and howling, but he was a man grown soft on power. Mara drove him to his knees. She looked into his bloodied face, saw the fear there, the desperate, gnawing fear of a man who had thought himself untouchable. She tightened the chain around his throat. "You built your kingdom with chains," she said, her voice low and steady. "Now die with them." Crane's struggles slowed, then stopped. Mara stood over his corpse as the town burned around her, the smoke rising thick and black into the night. The others came into the hall, battered, bloodied, but victorious. They looked to her. Mara uncoiled the chain from her fists and let it fall to the stones. "This place is yours now," she said. "I have no use for it." She turned from them then, moving through the shattered gates, past the fields soaked in blood, past the banners falling into ash. Lark ran after her, keeping pace. They rode north again, into the darkening hills, where no one yet dared build walls or plant flags. The world behind them was broken. But Marrow was not. She carried her scars like weapons, her chains like history, her silence like a blade honed for the work yet to come. And she would not stop. Not until the last chain was broken. Not until the last post stood empty under the wide, merciless sky.